Om Tavagatamratam Tapta Jivanam Kaviviridhitam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Srimadatam Bhuvigananti Bhurirajana. Your words are like nectar, bringing life to scorched souls. They are praised by poets and remove all sin. They are auspicious to hear, wonderful and exalted. Those who spread these words throughout the world are truly giving souls. Welcome everyone to our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. We started last week the chapter, The Master and Vijay Krishna Goswami. And the date is December 14th, Thursday, 1882. I came very close to skipping this portion because there's a lot of what Thakur used to call comedy kanchan in this section. Probably there are a number of you who jumped into this class after we began. The very first or second session, I spent quite a bit of time discussing this term, this phrase that Sri Ramakrishna used, comedy kanchan, which literally means woman in gold, and it's translated that way in the English translation of Swami Atmajnanananda, although he has a long footnote the first time trying to explain that it stands for the really lust and greed. These were the two terms that Thakur used, comedy kanchan. He liked alliterative phrases, catchy slogans. Probably this was something that was used before him. I doubt if this was original with him when he spoke to women, or when Holy Mother gave the same teaching to her women disciples. She would talk about Purush and Kanchan, the man in gold, so we shouldn't look at it as kind of a sexist thing. On the other hand, there does seem to be the feeling that the attraction that a man has for a woman is perhaps stronger, and this is more or less what Thakur was talking about. The reason I'm going through this is that sometimes I try to picture myself as a woman reading these things and think, why is he blaming women for everything? He's not blaming women for everything. He's trying to explain what he sees as a fact of life for most people, that this attachment that a man has for his wife to a certain degree, and it may differ in some cases. Sometimes the woman may be more attached to the husband, sometimes the husband more attached to the wife. But he sees that this, for many, this attachment, and even through this attachment, this willingness to sacrifice oneself with regard to the job that one takes and the demands of life and everything, he sees this in some cases as a bondage to those who are trying to lead a spiritual life. This is number one. Number two, many of the times when he talks about these things, his future monastic disciples are there. He's trying to encourage them to lead a life of freedom. An unmarried life is a life of freedom from certain obligations. This is obvious. The married life, there are obligations to the wife, to the husband, to the children, to the parents. Now, sometimes in sadhu life that may remain, but there won't be the husband and wife and the children. And Thakur knows who is qualified for what. Now, in this chapter, he's talking to Vijay Goswami. Vijay Krishna Goswami was only about 5 years younger than Sri Ramakrishna. So if we work our way back, I don't know that much about his previous life. There's a lot written about him afterwards, because he had kind of a cult following at one point in the Vaishnava tradition. But perhaps whatever children, if he had children, that they were grown up, and the wife was well situated, that there was a joint family, something like that. But Sri Ramakrishna spoke to him the same way he spoke to his future monastic disciples, because he felt that Vijay was somebody who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Number one was the Brahmo Samaj, that Vijay had the blood of a lover of God flowing through his veins. This is the type of language Thakur used. He came from a Goswami family. That means that they traced their lineage back to, in his case, I believe, Advaita Goswami, but anyhow, to the original companions of Chaitanya Deva. And number two, he was had the spirit of renunciation. So he was ill fit to be in the Brahmo Samaj, because they believed in a kind of a dry type of devotion. The formless, personal God to a certain extent, but formless, and based on some Upanishadic idea of Brahma. So it was not in keeping with his highly devotional nature. And worldly life and service, because the Brahmo Samaj was a paid position. All of that was inhibiting this innate desire to renounce everything. So this is the backdrop for all of this. I'll try to explain things a little more as we go along. We had finished last time this whole section about suicide, you may remember. And after that, Thakur, he changes the subject. He says, it is said that there are four classes of human beings: the bound, those aspiring after liberation, the liberated, and the ever-perfect. Now, this was a very important aspect of Thakur's teachings, and not everyone liked it. That very often, especially the Brahmos and the well-educated people, they like to think everyone was equal. There's no big difference between people. Otherwise, God is not impartial. Has he given more power to one and less to another? God dwells within all of us equally. Then why these big distinctions? But Thakur is talking now about the individual with his or her own samskaras and their karma, and the term that Thakur used and the concept was adhar, receptacle. What could they hold? So not only they may be highly evolved people, but they're not a large receptacle, so that the amount of spiritual power they can have will be limited, the amount of spiritual practice will be limited. He liked to use this imagery with Swami Vivekananda and the other direct disciples. But so he would always classify people according to their spiritual stature, according to how far they'd gone along on the spiritual path, whether they'd even started or not. Now, one thing that we'll notice, because I believe all of us will find some things to identify with among those who are on the lowest rung of the ladder, those are bound souls. So what I've noticed and what I feel is that these categories aren't so separate and distinct. What I mean by that is that in some elements of our life we may be advanced, and in others we may be less advanced. We may find some aspects of our personality that we do resemble more the bound soul. Other aspects we may find ourselves identifying more with those who are on the spiritual path, or those who have made some progress. Anyhow, we'll get to these things. So he starts out that it is said, so this isn't original with him. Sometimes he'll talk about, there's a Baul tradition, and that they have this theory. There's the Kardabhaja sect and some others. Four classes of human beings: the bound, those aspiring after liberation. These will be, so the Buddhajib, the Sadhaka, the liberated, the Mukta, and the ever-perfect, Nitya Mukta. So he uses these different expressions. This world is like a fishing net. Men are the fish, and God, whose Maya has created this world, is the fisherman. When the fish are entangled in the net, some of them try to tear through its meshes in order to get their liberation. Now look, this is, Thakur is not talking about human birth in any sense other than the striving for liberation. He's not talking about 4 stages of life or acquiring dharma and leading a good householder life and fulfilling obligations. He really is very one-pointed with this, that the goal of human life and the purpose of human life is God realization, or self-realization, or the truth, casting off this Maya, however we understand it. So when the fish are entangled in the net, some of them try to tear through its meshes in order to get their liberation. They are like the men striving after liberation. But by no means all of them escape. Only a few jump out of the net with a loud splash. So he's starting out with the second category. He's not starting out with what he calls a buddha-jib, with those bound souls. He's starting out in his explanation with those who have come to the understanding that there's something to be attained in this lifetime, that we're not born here just to go through life with our ups and downs and our enjoyments and our suffering and then just to end it with that. So he's starting out with that, and of those who strive, he says, by no means all of them escape. Only a few jump out of the net with a loud splash. And then people say, there goes a big one. We read about 1 out of 1,000, and the story of the kites and all of these things. So we know that very few, if it's a vast majority, will start to run out of people. These are the ones who won't be wording it. In like manner, 3 or 4 men attain liberation. Again, some fish are so careful by nature that they are never caught in the net. So he's starting out with those who really in this one lifetime go from category 2 to category 3. They're striving and they attain liberation. So they become siddhas. But again, some fish are so careful by nature that they are never caught in the net. Some beings of the ever-perfect class, like Narada, are never entangled in the meshes of worldliness. So these will be the Nitya Siddhas. These are more than Jivan Muktas. These are those who come back again after attaining perfection. Whether they were perfect at birth, there are 2 different ways of looking at it. Sometimes Thakur explains it one way, sometimes his direct disciples explain it one way. There's no clear-cut answers to all of these things. We were reading the other day Swami Atmajnanananda. He says that there are those who attain perfection in this lifetime, and they're the ones who don't jump over the wall. They come back to tell others. They can be born again, and they can even join the inner circle. They can become Ishvara Kotis. This is what Swami Shivananda, Mahapurush Maharaj, said. So these Nitya Siddhas, we don't have to think of them as from time immemorial, whatever that means, of having always been perfect, but they can be like the Bodhisattvas who get their enlightenment, but want to come back and help others get their own enlightenment. Most of the fish are trapped, but they are not conscious of the net and of their imminent death. No sooner are they entangled than they run headlong, net and all, trying to hide themselves in the mud. So this will be the first class. Now this is a buddha-jib. Now when we say buddha-jib means a bound soul, we shouldn't think that they're stamped at birth, that they'll never attain liberation. Everyone will attain liberation. Thakur says that in a time of a big festival, when they'll distribute food. Some of you remember in the early days at Bellermutt, when before the big dining hall came, when they would hand out khichdi prasad in little leaf baskets, and there'd be a long line. Some will be first in line, and they'll get it. Some will be very last in line. It may be getting towards dark by the time they get it. But he says no one remains abhukta. No one will remain unfed, that everyone will get it. So when he talks about a bound soul, he's talking about their present state of mind. Maybe it's a whole lifetime. Maybe they'll be born bound souls and something will happen. They'll have some tragedy or they'll meet some great soul, something will happen, and then they'll switch to the next category. So there's something a little bit fluid about this. Thakur talks about it, it gives the impression that we're stuck in one category or the other. I don't think that this is what he meant. But those who don't make any attempt, and those who continue the way they are, they'll remain like that. In the Gita we read about those who are enmeshed in Rajoguna, that they won't make spiritual progress. Those who are in tamas, they'll even go lower. But everyone eventually will have to come up, and it can change in one lifetime. So we're not stamped that way. We're not stuck. We may say, oh, when I read this, I see that I'm a bound soul. There's no hope. There's hope. But he's saying, this is why he's telling all of this. There's hope if we realize it. If the fish realizes that he's burrowing himself in the mud and not getting free, that he's still caught in the net, then he'll wake up and do something. So this is the point of all of this, not to say that some people will never get liberation. Thakur didn't believe that. He believed everyone, sooner or later, maybe not in this lifetime, maybe not in 100 lifetimes. We don't know anything about these things. So he says that some of the fish, no sooner they entangled than they run headlong, net and all, trying to hide themselves in the mud. So picture it, this net is something a little bit fine. They're not quite sure what's happening, but they can actually burrow into the mud with the net still underneath them, so that they're still trapped. They are still inside the net, but they think they are quite safe there. A bound creature is immersed in worldliness, and now we get our comedy conscience. In woman in gold. Now, some of you may have noticed, those who follow along, that except in very, very rare cases, I will say lust in gold. This was the instruction that I got from Swami Swahanandaji. Swami Swahanandaji said that, look, it may sound hurtful for the women devotees to talk about this woman in gold all the time. Replace it with lust in gold. Sometimes it doesn't quite make sense. So today I'm going to do both of them, and we'll try to figure out why he's saying all of this. So the bound creatures immersed in worldliness, in woman in gold, or lust in gold, having gone deep into the mire of degradation. But still he believes he is quite happy and secure. The liberated and the seekers after liberation look on the world as a deep well. So now remember that he's talking to Vijay Krishna Goswami at a very critical point in his life. He had become a little bit upset with the Brahmo Samaj. First of all, earlier with the Keshav, and he split and started this other group. But he was being forced to try to fit into a category that didn't work well for him. So he was disenchanted with the Brahmo Samaj. And Thakur knew these two things, that part of the problem was he needed this devotional path. And the other was that he was 100% ripe for renunciation. Now, in our modern day context, we may feel, and I don't blame anybody, I also feel it a little bit, that too bad, nobody forced him to get married. He still has a wife. I don't know what type of family, as I say, if he had small children, no children, if they were grown up, if they were earning a lot of money, they could look after their mother. I don't know anything about that. But in those days, things were different. And this taking of sannyasa, this was to be done after the birth of one son. This was one prerequisite. We know this because of Swamiji's own grandfather. As soon as a son was born, he left. This, some people may have looked down upon it, but this was considered legitimate in those days, that he at least gave his wife a son who will grow up and look after her and everything. This is why Swamiji's father was an only child. He had no uncles on that side. So he's talking to Vijay the same way he would be talking to these young future monks, Swamiji and the others. But still, he believes he is quite happy and secure. The liberated and the seekers after liberation look on the world as a deep well. Sometimes he'll say their relatives as black cobras. And the world is a burning forest fire. Now, these are the things that we read about according to some of the direct disciples, that this was a rather mild language. And when he got them alone, that the burning words of renunciation were even stronger. We can't even imagine how it can be stronger than some of this. Now, when Thakur said all these things, he knows M is there, he knows M is recording, but is he really thinking that one day people in America and men and women will be reading these things? I doubt it. I doubt it. Sometimes what was more important to Thakur was the person he was talking to. And some things we have to pick and choose what things really apply to us here. That it doesn't mean to say that every married man should look upon the world this way and should give up his wife and kids and all of that. Doesn't mean that. So the liberated and the seekers after liberation look on the world as a deep well. They do not enjoy it. Therefore, after the attainment of knowledge, the realization of God, some give up their bodies. But such a thing is rare indeed. Now, this ties in a little bit with this talk of suicide that we had before. So, the point is that whether the body is there or not there is almost irrelevant to a God-realized soul. Thakur gives so many examples. When they make a certain type of preparation, this Kaviraji medication, where they'll take something, it'll be some type of metallic, mercury and other things like that, and it'll be in a bottle, and they'll put it in a fire, and it'll, through the heat of the fire, it'll do whatever it has to do, all melt together and become the thing that they need. I don't know how they do all of this, but he says after it's done, the way they get it out, they break the bottle. And then he says, because there's no other way, you can't pour it out anymore. It was probably some liquid type of thing. So he says, it's already hardened inside. It makes no difference to the substance inside, whether the bottle is broken or not broken. That means whether the physical body is there or not there. Because the one is united, the Jivatman is united with the Paramatman, anyhow. But he's saying this is something rare, and it's not something that people should even contemplate. We're not trying to have God realization so that we can give up the body. We should enjoy the world after that realization. We should see God everywhere and see the divine dwelling within all the beings. Now he'll talk a bit about these bound creatures. This is a little bit tough. The bound creatures, entangled in worldliness, will not come to their senses at all. They suffer so much misery and agony. They face so many dangers, and yet they will not wake up. Now, this is what I was saying before. We will all find things here that we can identify with, because there are certain things that we do, habits that we have, that we do repeatedly, knowing that it's not helpful for us. They may not be terrible things, maybe small things, but this shouldn't define us. We should just recognize that there are a lot of tendencies within the mind, even sometimes compartments within the mind. We're very brilliant people who do very stupid things. Huh? We see. I shouldn't mention this, but I always think of President Clinton, who I liked very much, who was a brilliant man, brilliant IQ, and yet fooling around in the White House with a young aide, how stupid it was. But the same mind. So we see that in some aspects we're very brilliant, and some we're like small children. So as I say, don't feel bad if some of these things you say, oh, that's me. Huh? I also feel like that when I read some of these things. The camel loves to eat thorny bushes. The more it eats the thorns, the more the blood gushes from its mouth. Still, it must eat thorny plants and will never give them up. They taste good. This is what Thakur says. There's something called the hog plum. I'm not sure what exactly it is, but Thakur says that really it's got a big pit, huh? And it's skin on the outside. so that there's not too much of the flesh, just a little bit. And if you eat it, you can get sick and get colic, he says. But it tastes good. And people don't mind getting a little bit sick. We have so many people, intelligent people, that they like spicy food or fried food or something like that. And they know that they'll suffer a little bit with heartburn that night. And still they do it. Because they'll get over it. Yeah, I'll suffer a little bit, but it tastes good. Now, does that mean that these are bound souls? It just means in that one little aspect of life that their sense of discrimination isn't too sharp. Or they're simply willing. They're simply willing to do it. That there's not much enjoyment in life. You know, one of the great statements that Swamiji's father made to Swamiji when Narendra was a young boy. He saw that many of his relatives, they were lazy people. They didn't like to work. They would take alcohol or drugs, some of them even. And as a little boy, Swamiji asked his father. He said, because his father supported them all. He said, why do you support them when they do all of these things? And he said a very beautiful thing. He said, you won't understand it now. You're too young. When you get older, you'll see that this life is full of misery. If they can get a few minutes respite from that misery, even by doing this, then should we deny that to them? It just showed his compassion and everything. So there'll be plenty of people who think that, yes, what's the harm? I'll get a little bit of enjoyment. This life is a tedious life. It's not so simple. We may say that, we shouldn't go to the movies, we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do that. What's the harm, really, to get a little bit of enjoyment if we have discrimination and we don't get too attached to all of these things? A little diversion is good. I always remember, I believe it was Swami Shankaranandaji, anyhow, one of the presidents of the order. He told the young monks, it's good to have a hobby. We don't have a hobby. What kind of a silly thing is that to say? Whole life should be devoted to spiritual practice. Even for very highly qualified monks, it's very hard, 24 hours a day. His point was, if there's something that refreshes the mind, and of course it has to be a good thing, working in the garden, working in the wood shop, whatever it is, something like that, that during that time one can keep the mind on God also, and use one's creativity. These are nice things. We shouldn't be too puritanical, and we shouldn't be overly strict. This is also a mistake in spiritual life. As I say, we don't want to make the string of the veena so taut that when we go to play it snaps. So there should be a little bit of leeway here. But Thakur was talking about people that this is their main philosophy of life, to get everything possible out of life. The man of worldly nature suffers so much sorrow and affliction, but he forgets it all in a few days and begins his old life ever again. Suppose a man has lost his wife, or she has turned unfaithful. Lo, he marries again. Or take the instance of a mother. Her son dies and she suffers bitter grief, but after a few days she forgets all about it. The mother, so overwhelmed with sorrow a few days before, now attends to her toilet and puts on her jewelry. Now again, we have to bring in the eye of compassion with all of this. That no mother loses a child and gets over it that easily, but perhaps there are times when they have to put it out of their mind, or they do these things to try to help get over it. These are very difficult things. His point is that we make the same mistakes over and over again. That we're not learning from things. This is the point that he's making. The father becomes bankrupt through the marriage of his daughters, yet he goes on having children year after year. People are ruined by litigation, yet they go to court all the time. There are men who cannot feed the children they have, who cannot clothe them or provide decent shelter for them, yet they have more children every year. So not learning from our mistakes, or at least from our experiences. Again, the worldly man is like a snake trying to swallow a mole. The snake can neither swallow the mole nor give it up. Thakur uses this example with regard to a qualified disciple and a qualified guru. He says when the disciple is not so qualified and when the guru is not a really legitimate guru, he says it's like an ordinary water snake who tries to eat a frog, catches hold of the frog, and the frog is too big for it. So it gets stuck in its mouth. It's incapable of either spitting out or swallowing it. So he says it's misery and suffering both for the snake. The mouth is wide open, it would like to swallow it, but it can't, would like to get rid of it, but it can't. And of course for the frog, who's caught in the grip of it. But he's saying in general now that this is what we do. We bite off more than we can chew. And we think that we'll get joy out of these things. Many of the things that we try to possess end up possessing us. We become slaves to these things. We get something that we think we'll enjoy, and we have to work overtime just to pay for it. And there's no time to enjoy it. I remember in the 50s that all of these time-saving devices came out. Time-saving devices, dishwashers and washing machines. Before that, nobody used any of these things. And they thought people will have so much leisure that forget about this 40-hour-a-day week, it'll go down to 30 hours. Everything with, even today, these robots, this and that, we have to work longer to earn enough money to buy all of these things. So things don't always work out the way we plan them. Once I met a relative of Keshav Sen, 50 years old. He was playing cards, as if the time had not yet come for him to think of God. Okay, is it bad to play cards? We have to understand what Thakur is saying and not just make a blanket statement. Oh, if anybody plays cards, they can't be spiritual people. Look at Swami Atmajnanananda. He loved to play cards. He loved to play cards. And he would get his attendants, he would make them play cards. And if one of his attendants was there and he always lost, he would say, oh, this fellow, he's bad luck for me. He even kicked out one of his attendants. We have to understand that there's a difference. We can't make these blanket statements. He was a God-realized soul, a perfect soul, who had to try to keep his mind down. Just like he liked fishing, he liked to play cards, to keep his mind down. Every situation is different. There may be some people who get some relaxation, some enjoyment out of these simple things. But those who in old age have nothing to do, have no interest in spiritual life, just find something to pass their time. That's what he's talking about. So don't take these things too literally. If any of you enjoy, you have a bridge game that you play with your close friends who are also devotees, something like that, perfectly fine. Not what he means. He talks one time about the priests in this Siddheshwari Kali temple, that he goes and he sees them play cards and back. That's different. They're priests. They're supposed to, their minds is supposed to be fixed on the puja and worship and everything. There's another characteristic of the bound soul. If you remove him from his worldly surroundings to a spiritual environment, he will pine away. The worm that grows in filth feels very happy there. It thrives in filth. It will die if you put it in a pot of rice. Filth. This means that the worms that enter into the body and get into the digestive system. These people can get worms. Dogs we see will get worms like that. This is where they live. They like to live there. Now these things sound very terrible. Thakur is trying to awaken something in this Vijay Krishna Goswami. Perhaps he knows that he'll renounce the world and that he's a catalyst for this. Very hard to say, but we're getting some of the very, very harsh realities of life here that we don't like to look at all of the time. And as I say, sometimes a little bit too harsh. Too harsh in the sense that if we take them all together, that we may have one little area of life where we resemble the bound soul. That's right, that's okay. That with the three gunas, no one is 100% sattvic. We may be the most energetic people and always ready to do things, but there'll be one or two things that we postpone, that we simply don't really enjoy doing, that we procrastinate on one or two things with something else that we like, with boundless energy. So the mind is a complicated thing. All remain silent. So Sometimes if Thakur talks to one person, there are other people there, and they're thinking, oh my God, what is he saying? There's one case where he's talking to Narendra, and fiery words of renunciation, and one of the householder devotees says, but sir, what about us? What will happen to us? And he says more or less, oh, you be quiet, I'm not talking to you. This is for him. So sometimes it's that way also. I don't remember who else is here. M, of course, is here. Balaram is there. Balaram is the ideal householder. The tremendous devotion and the whole life is giving to spiritual practice. No bondage, didn't care for money, wealth, or anything like that, but a householder. He's not saying these things for Balaram's sake in order to inspire him to renounce everything. A few other devotees there. We don't know who else exactly. All remain silent. Vijay. What must the bound soul's condition of mind be in order to achieve liberation? Okay, now this is important because bound soul and achieving liberation. We can say, well, if one is bound, then forget about liberation. That means we're bound now, or to a certain extent we're bound. Most of us will find that we can identify with the seeker after liberation, the sadhaka, and with the bound soul. If we weren't bound souls, we wouldn't be in this world. We're here because we haven't attained liberation. Except for the few Jivan Muktas among us, perhaps. But, but there aren't too many of them. So he asked a very nice question. What must the bound soul's condition of mind be in order to achieve liberation? Now, we're going to get this Kamini Kanchan again. Because he's talking to the men. And this is very important, that we don't come away with the idea that Thakur looked down upon women. Of all the great saints that we know of, I think Thakur was the one who could identify with women better than anybody else. And when he was with them, and he would whenever he visited the householder devotees' homes, he would take time to go to the inner apartment or take his meal there. And all the neighboring women would be there, and they would just have so much fun with him. He would tell jokes and they would laugh, and when he went through his period of looking upon himself as a handmaid of God, then he could mix with the women freely just as if he was one of them, and laugh and sing, and they would treat him the way they would never treat another man. They felt so comfortable with him. When he was a little boy, he loved to go to the lahas with the daughters of the family, spend all of his time with them. So he was very, very comfortable with the company of women. But he knew that that was him. He had no attachment. And he knew that for most of the male devotees, that the mind gets affected. We know this. Some studies have been done about a co-ed education as opposed to all boys and all girls. And it's very, very clear that when the boys and the girls are sitting together, this is even before there's any thought of any sexual things or anything, but still, boys like to show off in front of girls. Huh? So just the ability to concentrate, you separate them, and all of a sudden, yeah, they can concentrate a little bit better. There is some truth to that. Not that I'm in favor of separate boys and girls education. There are advantages to co-ed education also. But yes, this is the nature of the human mind, and perhaps more the male mind. Perhaps more the male mind. And why do I say that? We just look at the animal kingdom. Is in all different species, is the male who has to attract the female species seems quite fine without them. Huh? They can do something in the mating season to attract the male, but they're the aggressors. So it's the same thing. So anyhow, his first thing he says is he can free himself from attachment to kamani kanchan, woman in gold, or lust and greed, if by the grace of God he cultivates a spirit of strong renunciation. Now, Thakur speaks of renunciation in a very similar way that he speaks of determination. So renunciation for him, it doesn't simply mean that some distaste for the world. It also means some strong determination to accomplish something, to not be dissuaded from it, to, of course, accomplish God realization. And there has to be the positive element for him. This anuraga always goes hand in hand with the vairagya. So he says, strong spirit of renunciation. What is the strong renunciation? One who has only a mild spirit of renunciation says, well, all will happen in the course of time. Let me now simply repeat the name of God. But a man possessed of a strong spirit of renunciation feels restless for God. So there's vyakulata, as the mother feels for her own child. See, renunciation without this positive thing is a little bit kind of escapism. Yeah, I don't care for the world. There's too much work. That I always seem to suffer from these things. Let me try to get out of it. Thakur didn't like this attitude. There should be some strong pull for something higher. That has to be there. So a man of strong renunciation seeks nothing but God. He regards the world as a deep well and feels as if he were going to be drowned in it. Here it is. He looks on his relatives as venomous snakes. He wants to fly away from them. Now, the stage comes in spiritual life when one has that attitude. What we find very often, look at the case of Buddha, that yes, he felt like he had to leave. He couldn't bear another second. There had been a huge feast in the palace, and his young wife, beautiful young wife, had just given birth to a son. And he saw everyone there. They'd eaten too much and they drank too much. Some had gotten sick or fell asleep drunk on the floor. He looked at it as a living hell. He had to leave. But after his realization, he went back. He went back and he looked after his wife, and son became a monk, wife became a leader of the order. Many times we see in monastic life that this initial feeling of renunciation is like that. That even to see parents and everything, we want to just escape. But then after some time, that lessens, not that, I would say matures. It matures, so that many of the monks of our order, which is not the same as Orthodox monks in India, will keep some relationship with family. Usually quietly, but and this was Thakur's idea, they don't want to see parents, especially mother, they don't want to see them suffer in any way. So it's not out of attachment to them. If it's attachment, then it's a dangerous thing. But it's just out of love for them. He never thinks, this is the person of strong renunciation, let me first make some arrangement for my family and then I shall think of God. He has great inward resolution. Now there'll be a lot of stories about those who renounce the world after being married. We don't allow that in our order. Now, the early days, of course, some of the direct disciples were married. Some of the second generation, some of the most illustrious Swamis, are Swami Jagadanandaji, who was a great scholar and everything. He was married and with family, but it was never encouraged in our order. And now it's completely not allowed. Those even who had been married are not allowed to join. But this was part of the culture of the day, that yadahar eva virajet tadahar eva paravrajet. On the very day that one feels this burning renunciation, on that day one should leave, should walk away, should renounce the world. This was a feeling that people had at that time. Anyhow, Thakur talks like this, but there were very few married disciples that he wanted to see renounce the world. His own direct disciples, that was a different story. What tiny little karma was there that caused Rakal to marry, we don't know. And somehow Thakur understood it and didn't think it was anything bad. When Yogan Maharaj, Swami Yogananda married, he said, don't worry, I'll see that your wife also wants to lead a spiritual life, it won't be a problem. So these are curious things. We don't know why exactly this had to happen that way. Let me tell you a story about strong renunciation. At one time, there was a drought in a certain part of the country. The farmers began to cut long channels to bring water to their fields. One farmer was stubbornly determined. He took a vow that he would not stop digging until the channel connected his field with the river. Now remember, this is all symbolic. We're taking a vow that we won't stop calling on God until we have realization. He set to work. The time came for his bath, and his wife sent their daughter to him with oil. "Father," said the girl, "it is already late. Rub your body with oil and take your bath." "Go away," thundered the farmer. "I have too much to do now." It was past midday, and the farmer was still at work in his field. He didn't even think of his bath. Then his wife came and said, "Why haven't you taken your bath? The food is getting cold. You overdo everything. You can finish the rest tomorrow, or even today after dinner." The farmer scolded her furiously and ran at her, spade in hand, crying, "What, have you no sense? There's no rain, the crops are dying. What will the children eat? You'll all starve to death. I've taken a vow not to think of bath and food today before I bring water to my field." The wife saw his state of mind and ran away in fear. Through a whole day's back-breaking labor, the farmer managed by evening to connect his field with the river. Then he sat down and watched the water flowing into his field with a murmuring sound. His mind was filled with peace and joy. He went home, called his wife, and said to her, "Now give me some oil and prepare me a smoke." With serene mind, he finished his bath and meal and retired to bed, where he snored to his heart's content. The determination he showed is another example of strong renunciation. So this is what I say, that really we're talking about vairagya, but it's really more this idea that I won't quit until I reach the goal. Stop not until the goal is reached. How many times Swamiji said that? Arise, awake, and stop not till the goal is reached. This strong determination. Kubrok chai. Thakur used to say this. We need great, I think usually it's translated as grit or determination. That I'm not going to give up. And there'll be obstacles. There will be people who will tell me that this is a waste of time. That why do you do this every day? You get up early, you're tired. Why not enjoy things? Life is short. We say, get out of here. I won't listen to that. That I made a vow, I'm going to do it, and I'll try my very best. And I won't stop until I've accomplished it, or life goes. That's all. Now, there was another farmer who was also digging a channel to bring water to his field. His wife too came to the field and said to him, "It's very late, come home. It isn't necessary to overdo things." The farmer didn't protest much, but put aside his spade and said to his wife, "Well, I'll go home since you ask me to." All laugh. That man never succeeded in irrigating his field. This is a case of mild renunciation. As with strong determination, the farmer cannot bring water to his field, so also without intense yearning, a man cannot realize God. Then to Vijay. So really he's addressing Vijay the whole time. This is really for his sake. "Why don't you come here now as frequently as before?" Vijay, "Sir, I wish to very much, but I am not free. I have accepted work in the Brahmo Samaj." He had no other means of earning a livelihood. I don't know if he ever had a career or anything. As I say, I don't know too much about his early life. And that type of work brings in very, very little money. It's not like working in an office. Even a civil servant or a clerk, they'll make more money. And even these other priests, of course, the Brahmin priests were supposed to be poor. This was part of the tradition. Every story you read from the Puranas or anything was, in a certain village there was a poor Brahmin. All start out like that. Because their glory was in their renunciation, their glory was in their learning, glory was in service, in just being the spiritual leaders. they were supposed to set that example and that ideal of not desiring too much worldly enjoyment or pleasure, but having some higher type of ideal. So there was never much scope for this Brahmin. He came from a high Brahmin family, of course, and to be a priest, not much scope to earn much money. There's a nice conversation between one Brahmin who comes to Sri Ramakrishna, and they're discussing very high spiritual things. And then Thakur finally says to him very sweetly, he says, "Have you been able to earn much today?" And he said, "No, sir, not much today." Because he knew that it was difficult for them to get by. So, Vijay, "Sir, I wish to very much, but I am not free. I've accepted work in the Brahmo Samaj." That work means he's an acharya. He'll do some type of priestly work and give some type of sermon. Master, "It is kamari kanchan, woman in gold or lust and greed, that binds man and robs him of his freedom." Now, in what sense does it rob someone? Only in the sense that now there's a duty and obligation. Even the very word duty, it means something we have to do. It means we're not free. And in those days, there were very few people who could make a very easy living and have a lot of leisure time. That they had to work very hard and take a lot of abuse in those days, because those who had at least office jobs and things, they were working under the British system. It was highly bureaucratic, always somebody above you, and making life miserable. And why were they doing it? They were doing it in order to support the family and get a little bit of enjoyment, however much they could. Thakur looked upon this as a type of bondage. He didn't like this idea of people taking service from others. He didn't mind certain types of occupations, but if it meant kind of licking the boots of the master, and demeaning oneself, humiliating oneself, or even telling lies in an office just in order to make money to survive, then he felt this was a type of bondage. Then, "It is woman that creates the need for gold." Okay, this simply means married life. And he's talking about a man, because the women didn't work in those days. There was no scope for them to get a job and be money earners. They looked after the family, after the household. So it was the men who had to work, and not simply because of women. The men had to work because they had taken to family life, because they wanted it. And it was for the sake of the children, of course, as much as the wife, and for the sake of society. But Thakur, this is the phrase that he used to use, kamari kanchan. "For woman, one man becomes the slave of another." So that means for the sake of the family, for worldly enjoyment. One becomes a slave of another and so loses his freedom. Then he cannot act as he likes. The priests in the temple of Govindaji in Jaipur were celibates at first, and at that time they had fiery natures. I went to this temple, a wonderful place in Jaipur. A wonderful place. There's I forget the other temples. There are a couple of temples there that are very, very famous. This, the image, the story is that this was one of the big temples in Vrindavan, this Govindaji temple, and there was fear that the temple would be desecrated at the time of one of the invasions, foreign invasions, and the image was moved temporarily to Jaipur, but remained there after that. Thakur, he may mention that, but it's in the Chaitanya literature also. So I remember going there, a very simple place, but the tremendous devotion there. You can feel it in the air. Very beautiful place. If anybody goes to Jaipur, make sure to go there. So the priests in the temple of Govindaji at Jaipur were celibates at first, and at that time they had fiery natures. Yeah, this is a monk. I don't have to do anything you tell me. What can you take from me? Do I have to go begging from you for money so that I can pay for school tuition for my kids or anything? I'm free. So you can say whatever you want, but I'm not going to do anything unless I want to do it. This is my goal in life. I know what I want to do. You're not going to dissuade me from that. Fiery natures. Once the king of Jaipur sent for them. So, but they're priests, so they're in between. They're not married, but still they have to do the bidding of the king, or at least they're supposed to. Once the king of Jaipur sent for them, but they didn't obey him. They said to the messenger, "Ask the king to come to see us." Huh? Who are we to go and on hands and knees go before the king? There's nothing that he can do for us, nothing that we need from him. After consultation, the king and his ministers arranged marriages for them. From then on, the king didn't have to send for them. They would come to him of themselves and say, "Your Majesty, we have come with our blessings. Here are the sacred flowers of the temple. Deign to accept them." They came to the palace, for now they always wanted money for one thing or another: the building of a house, the rice-taking ceremony of their babies, or the rituals connected with the beginning of their children's education. Then he tells another story. There is a story of the 1,200 Neras and 1,300 Nedis. These are those who shave their heads. So that means that there'll be monks and nuns. Nedis will be the women, and Neras will be the men. Virabhadra, the son of Nityananda Goswami, had 1,300 shaven-headed disciples. They attained great spiritual powers that alarmed their teacher. "My disciples have acquired great spiritual powers," thought Virabhadra. "Whatever they say to people will come to pass. Wherever they go, they may create alarming situations, for people offending them unwittingly will come to grief." Thinking thus, Virabhadra one day called them to him and said, "See me after performing your daily devotions on the bank of the Ganges." These disciples had such a high spiritual nature that while meditating they would go into samadhi and be unaware of the river water flowing over their heads during the flood tide. Then the ebb tide would come, and still they would remain absorbed in meditation. Now, 100 of these disciples had anticipated what their teacher would ask of them. This is good, because you have to pay off one by one. So there were 1,300, now there'll be 1,200 to go with the other 1,200. Lest they should have to disobey his injunctions, they had quickly disappeared from the place before he summoned them. So they did not go to Virabhadra with the others. The remaining 1,200 disciples went to the teacher after finishing their meditation. Virabhadra said to them, "These 1,300 nuns will serve you. I ask you to marry them." "As you please, revered sir," they said. "But 100 of us have gone away." Thenceforth, each of these 1,200 disciples had a wife. Consequently, of course, each of the other 1,200 had a husband. Consequently, they all lost their spiritual power. Their austerities did not have their original fire. The company of women robbed them of their spirituality because it destroyed their freedom. Now, it's not the company of women, it's their attachment to them. This is the point that I'm trying to make. Blame doesn't go to the women. Thakur says that a woman may be the most devoted and pure-hearted, but still it'll be the attachment of the man for her. This is not denigrating women or saying that this is some evil quality they have to attract men and to destroy men. No, this is that attachment that comes into the mind of men who have that worldly tendency. Okay, enough of woman in gold. So let us stop here. And yeah, so two things that I request everyone to try to remember. One is that we're not bound souls in the sense that we're forever bound. We're in a state of bondage because we're not God-realized souls. We all know that and we all accept that. But we're not stamped as bound souls. That we're both bound souls and we're also seekers. So this is something very important. The other thing is that we shouldn't have this feeling that Thakur is always putting down women. We'll see later, next week we should read, where Thakur says that we should look upon, men should look upon women as embodiments of the Divine Mother. And this is a tradition that we follow, that all the monks follow. You'll see that elderly monks will stand with folded hands before young girls. And call them Mataji, call them mother. Look upon everyone as their own mother or as an embodiment of the Divine Mother. To have this very respectful, reverential attitude. And really, the attitude of our order, mostly I would say because of the example of Holy Mother, is that there's something special about the devotional attitude and qualities of women. Swami Brahmananda used to say that women are by nature more spiritual than men. So we have to keep things in their proper context, know that Thakur is talking to the men throughout this book. We don't have a single instance where M is not there to record what he's saying to the women devotees. But we know from what they say how free he was, how loving he was with them, and how he would warn them also. Don't be too attached to your husbands and family life and everything. So we will stop here and close with our chant. Om Niranjanam Nityamanantarupam Bhaktanukam Bhathur Vikramai Ishavataram Bharamishamhityam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namama. We bow our heads before Sri Ramakrishna, who was stainless, of infinite nature, whose heart melts in sympathy for his devotees, who is an embodiment of the Divine and the Supreme Lord, and ever worthy of our worship. So I thank all of you for joining, and everyone please stay well, and hope to see you next Friday.